I drafted this video before the Club Q shooting, and I thought it would be in better taste to wait a few weeks before posting. The shooting is not included in this analysis because 2022 is not included in this analysis because 2022 is not over yet. As I'm sure everyone has heard, there is a violent epidemic of trans murders. Every year, trans homicides are hitting new highs. The violence is so bad that it is dangerous for trans people to exist. It's so intense that jokes, misgendering, incorrect pronouns, disagreement, or belief in the existence of objective reality are all forms of violence that literally contribute to literal murder of trans people. They are practically hunted in the streets the way media and activists speak of it. Most of these media reports trace back to numbers gathered by the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, an LGBTQ+ advocacy group which releases a yearly list of trans individuals murdered in the U.S. Side note, this is a different group from the HRW, the Human Rights Watch. The HRW is an international organization that focuses on all sorts of global human rights abuses. The HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, is an LGBTQ+ only group focused predominantly on the United States. The HRC releases a yearly list of U.S. trans murders, which the HRC repeatedly calls a crisis and epidemic. The yearly reports have such alarming titles as A Matter of Life and Death, A Time to Act Fatal Violence, A National Epidemic, Fatal Anti-Transgender Violence, An Epidemic of Violence. This language and ethos is echoed by media, activists, content creators, policymakers, and private individuals. What is the scale of this epidemic crisis? What do the numbers show? Let's take a look. The officially reported HRC numbers for 2016 to 2020 are 21, 25, 22, 22, and 37. The final report for 2021 has not been released yet, and there are conflicting preliminary reports, so I'm not going to include 2021. The year 2022 has not ended yet. Each report contains a few additional cases where the cause of death was not clearly murder, and 2017, 18, 19, and 2020 include a few additional cases for the prior year that were not included in the original reports. Including these expanded numbers, the HRC figures for 2016 to 2020 are 27, 30, 26, 28, and 40. The HRC includes details on each case, so going through those, these numbers can be further broken down by biological sex and gender identity. In these 5 years, one intersex person was reported in 2017. This person was killed by police during a psychiatric episode. I will not be including them in the rest of this analysis. Regarding born males and born females, these numbers are clearly lopsided. Looking at the percentages by biological sex, born male transitioners make up an average of roughly 91% of trans murders. Born female transitioners make up an average of roughly 9%. Obviously, all these numbers are tiny in comparison to a national population of over 300 million. But so is the population of trans people overall. The trans population is comparatively small, so of course the raw homicide numbers will also be small. To make sense of the numbers, we need to put them in context. To do this, I'm going to use homicide data from the FBI, population data from the World Bank, and trans population estimates from the Williams Institute at UCLA. The Williams Institute, using data from the last roughly half-decade, estimates 0.6% of the population over the age of 13 is transgender, and 0.52% of the population over the age of 18 is transgender. I'm going to use the lower number of 0.52%. According to the HRC, most of the trans victims are under 35 years old, and according to the Williams Institute, 1.31% in the age range of 18 to 24 years old is transgender. That's a 7-year age spread. The next age bracket is a 40-year age spread with a trans population rate of 0.45%. So using a population rate of 0.52% for a sub-demographic that is mostly under the age of 35 years old is an underestimate of the relevant population. Underestimating the population weighs the scale in favor of the claim that trans people are disproportionately murdered more often. This is the claim I am testing, so I want to make that claim as strong as possible. Likewise, overestimating the number of trans murders strengthens the claim. So for the numbers in this analysis, I am taking the lower estimates of population and the higher estimates of murders. The Williams Institute report does not include direct numbers for the biological sex of the trans population, but the report's survey of gender identity indicates the adult trans population is composed roughly equally of those born as male and those born as female. 38.5% are born male trans women, 35.9% are female-born trans men, and 25.6% are unspecified born and unspecified gender nonconforming. The World Bank gives the U.S. male population as slightly above 49.5% and the female population slightly below 50.5%. Adjusting that for a trans population of 0.52%, divided in half between biological males and females, 0.26% and 0.26%, gives 49.24% non-trans biological males and 50.24% non-trans biological females. Now, if every sex gender was murdered at equal rates, the homicide percentages would be exactly the same as the population percentages. And the ratio of homicide percentage versus population percentage for each category would be 1. Equal representation equals a ratio of 1. An underrepresentation would be a ratio of less than 1, and an overrepresentation would be a ratio greater than 1. If, for instance, trans individuals were murdered at twice the rate of their population prevalence, the homicide percent will be 1.04%, and the ratio will be 2. And the other ratios will be affected accordingly. If there is an epidemic of trans murders, if trans people are disproportionately murdered more often, then their ratio should be over 1. To find the homicide percentages for each category, I will use FBI data. The FBI's expanded homicide crime statistics include demographic data that is voluntarily submitted by law enforcement agencies. Most agencies participate, roughly around 15,000 out of 18,000 each year from 2016 to 2020. Only some 11,000 have reported so far for 2021, which is the other reason I am excluding 2021. The FBI data gives numbers for total victims, male victims, female victims, and unknown. I am taking the unknown category to mean transgender, although it could mean a line was left blank on paperwork somewhere. Either way, these numbers are higher than the HRC numbers, all higher except for the 2020 number, which, in a bit of data crunching that I am excluding from this video, the percentages for the final analysis that the HRC would yield for 2020 versus that of the FBI round out to the same percentage. So functionally, these numbers are equal to or greater than the HRC numbers, so using them is more charitable to the claim that there is a murderous epidemic. Note that there is an increase in all murders in 2020. That uptick in the trans column is not exclusive to trans people. Everyone in 2020 was getting murdered more often. Wonder why? There is no further breakdown of demographic data within the unknown category. However, using the relative percentages from the HRC data, we can estimate by taking 91% of the unknowns to be biologically male and 9% to be biologically female. Now, onto the homicide percentages, starting with the male and female rates. To find the percent of total homicide victims that were male, non-trans males, take the male victim number from a year and divide by the total victim count for that year. Then take the average for those 5 years. Do the same thing for females. At a glance, the male percentage is over 3 times that of females. Some people might be surprised here. The reason is females are murdered more than males by intimate partners and family members. But in terms of overall murders, including by strangers, men are murdered much more often. Here are the population percentages being compared to, and taking the ratio of homicide rate versus population rate. Both are quite different from 1. Males are overrepresented with a ratio of 1.59, and females are underrepresented with a ratio of 0.43. By taking a ratio of the ratios, we can see the relative rates of murder of males versus females. Males are murdered 3.72 times more often than females. Phrased another way, taking the reciprocal ratio, females are murdered 0.27 times as often as males, a little over a quarter as often. Moving on to the trans data, taking the FBI unknowns, all unknowns, and dividing by the FBI total gives an average for all 5 years of 0.24%. This is obviously lower than the population rate of 0.52%, and the ratio is 0.46, which is slightly higher than the female ratio, but still well under a ratio of 1. Trans people as a whole group are underrepresented. But what about trans women as a subgroup? The trans homicides are mostly of male-born transitioners. Using the FBI-derived estimates of trans male-born and trans female-born victims versus the total homicide victims gives an average of 0.22% for those male-born and 0.02% for those female-born. Both of these are lower than the population percentages of 0.26%. The ratio for those male-born is 0.84, below 1 in underrepresentation. The ratio for those female-born is 0.08, way below 1. Of the 4 demographics listed, non-trans males, non-trans females, male-born transitioners, female-born transitioners, the least likely to be murdered by a huge margin are female-born transitioners. The most likely to be murdered by a wide margin are non-trans males. Non-trans males have 19 times the murder rate of female-born transitioners. By comparison, the rate of non-trans males is close to 4 times that of non-trans females. Rather than bringing the demographic data more into alignment, female transitioning increases the demographic gap between biological male and biological female. Meanwhile, males who transition decrease the demographic gap between biological male and biological female rates. While non-trans males are murdered at close to 4 times the rate of non-trans females, male-born transitioners are murdered close to 2 times the rate of non-trans females. Male-born transitioners are still murdered more than biological females, but they are murdered at half the rate of non-trans males. Transitioning substantially decreases a biological male's risk of homicide. Transitioning in both categories substantially decreases murder rate. Non-trans males have about twice the murder rate of male-born transitioners. Male-born transitioners have about twice the murder rate of non-trans females. Non-trans females have about 5-fold the murder rate of female-born transitioners. And male transitioners have 10-fold the murder rate of female transitioners. So, according to these numbers, trans people are not disproportionately murdered more often. They are murdered less. These numbers are quite clear. This was simple and quick for me to do a preliminary check, though the video took a bit more time. Why are the people reporting on this not checking? Is it incompetence, or is this intentional?